The first time I saw that blue plastic cooler again, it was half buried in a tangle of weeds, its lid bleached nearly white by 19 summers. Someone had carved 3 letters into it, R plus L. The sun hit those grooves just right, and for a second I swear they glowed like they were still fresh. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I was 57 when the ranch hand called it in, but I was 30 when it all began, younger, sharper, and convinced every story had an ending. Back then, Oak Ridge was the kind of town where you didn't lock your truck if you were just running into the store. We were a working community, loggers, teachers, retirees, and folks who knew each other's dogs by name. You could smell sawdust from the mill clear across town, and by noon the mountain air would bake up to 90 degrees. July always meant river floats, barbecues, and weekend drives to the meadows just off the highway. Rachel Porter and Luke Hargrove fit right into that rhythm. I remember seeing them at the summer fair 2 weeks before everything changed. Rachel was handing out raffle tickets for the hospital fundraiser, her hair tucked behind her ears, smiling at every kid who came near. Luke stood nearby with a funnel cake powdered sugar down the front of his shirt, grinning like he didn't mind a bit. They were local kids, steady, polite, never any trouble. Eleanor, Rachel's mom, worked at the library back then. She was the type who always had a plate of lemon bars for the deputies when we stopped by. Her girl was her pride, first in the family, to go to college training to be a nurse. Luke, for his part, was trying to save enough money to get out of the line cook grind and maybe open a food truck. They talked about moving to Bend someday, somewhere with more light, more chances. Young love, small dreams. Nothing remarkable. And maybe that's why it hit us all so hard later. In the summer of '98, I was still on patrol, running day shifts out toward Willamette Forest. Most of my calls were small-town stuff. Loose cattle, a drunk at the diner, kids setting off fireworks too close to the trees. Life ran simple. Every morning I'd pour gas station coffee into the same thermos drive east past the turnout at Willow Bend Meadow and nod toward the same silver guardrail where folks sometimes parked to stretch their legs. The meadow looked harmless from the road, wide open grass ringed by fir trees, nothing but the sound of crickets and wind. It was the kind of place couples went to eat sandwiches and watch clouds drift. That Saturday, July 18th, started clear and bright. Forecast said 89 degrees light wind from the west. I remember because I had just finished writing up a fender bender when the dispatcher mentioned a ranger radioing in about 2 young people he'd waved to out by Willow Bend. Looked like a picnic, he said. Nice day for it. I didn't think much of it. Around here, people were always pulling off to eat lunch on the grass. We were surrounded by beauty. You couldn't blame anyone for wanting to sit in it a while. When you live in a town like ours, the calendar turns on small rituals. Friday night lights at the high school coffee at the Shell Station Church on Sunday, the volunteer fire department pancake breakfast every first weekend of the month. You think you know your neighbors and they think they know you. For years, I believed that knowing was a kind of safety net that trouble only found strangers, not people with roots in the same dirt. Looking back, I can see tiny things I missed. Eleanor mentioned once that Rachel had been more tired than usual staying up late studying. Luke had picked up extra shifts and was driving his old sedan until the tires showed thread. They were young, overworked, saving for something better. Nothing that would raise a flag. The night before the picnic, Rachel stopped by her mom's house to borrow a cooler. Eleanor said she wiped it out, packed it with ice, and reminded her daughter to bring sunscreen. That cooler blue and white cheap plastic wasn't anything special. Everyone owned one like it back then. That evening, Oak Ridge looked golden. Porch lights blinked on early, and kids chased fireflies behind chain-link fences. I was home by 8, the windows open to let in the scent of pine. From my deck, I could see the highway curve into the hills dotted with headlights. Somewhere out there, Rachel and Luke were probably talking about weekend plans, maybe watching a movie, maybe loading that cooler for the next day. It was just another quiet night in a quiet town. Sunday morning came with the usual hum, lawnmowers, sprinklers, a dog barking somewhere down Elm Street. I stopped at the diner for pancakes before my shift. Luke was supposed to be working the evening line, but the cook told me he'd asked off, said he wanted to spend the day with Rachel. Good for him. The cook had laughed, flipping bacon. Kids earned a break. I remember nodding, thinking that's how life should be. Work hard. Take a Sunday for yourself. By late morning, the sky had that bright humming quality it gets before the heat settles in. Highway 58 shimmered like glass. I passed the Willow Bend turnout just after 11:30. The meadow looked peaceful, the grass waving in sunlight. Nothing about it said danger, not yet. Rachel and Luke left town around noon. They stopped at the Rite Aid on Main Street for snacks and sunscreen. There's the receipt for that time-stamped 12:17 p.m. From there, it's only a 20-minute drive to the meadow. They'd planned it simple, a blanket, a portable grill, a couple of sodas, nothing fancy. Folks remember seeing their silver car parked neatly under the trees, front pointed toward the highway, like they intended to leave in time for dinner. That's how we all lived, measured, unhurried, sure we'd always come home before dark. The thing about memory is it doesn't warn you which moments will stick. You don't know the ordinary sights you'll replay years later. For me, it's the way the late day light hit that meadow soft and even like the world had no edges. It's the way the air smelled faintly of clover when I drove past. I didn't stop. I had no reason to. If I'd known, I'd have rolled down my window, maybe looked longer toward those trees. Eleanor called the station the next day asking if we'd seen her daughter's car. Said Rachel hadn't answered her evening check-in. I told her it was probably fine kids that age lost track of time, especially on summer weekends. Still something in her voice lingered with me. It wasn't panic exactly, more like a tremor under the words the kind a mother gets when she already knows something's wrong but can't say why. That evening I drove out past Willow Bend again on my way home. The sun was dropping low, streaking the grass in gold. The same silver sedan sat parked along the tree line. From a distance, it looked orderly. Doors closed, nothing out of place. But the longer I looked, the more that stillness felt unnatural. No movement in the meadow, no laughter, no sign of a picnic wrapping up. I told myself they'd gone for a walk, that I was reading too much into it. But as I turned back toward town, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror, jaw-tight hand gripping the wheel, and I knew what that meant. Some part of me had already begun to worry. That night, the town settled under the soft hum of crickets. I remember sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching a porch light flicker down the street. Somewhere out there, 2 young people hadn't made it home yet, and a mother was staring at her own kitchen phone, waiting for it to ring. The meadow was quiet, the highway empty, and the stars came out one by one like nothing had changed. But somewhere between that laughter in the sun and the silence that followed, something unseen had already begun to move. When the call came through that Monday morning, the dispatcher's voice was flat routine. Possible abandoned vehicle Willow Bend turnout, silver sedan. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee and didn't think much of it at first. Cars were left along that stretch all the time. Flat tires, hikers gone longer than planned, folks pulled off to nap. But when I heard the license plate, something tightened in my chest. It was the same number Eleanor Porter had read to me the night before, her voice shaking just enough to give me a chill I didn't admit to her then. By the time I reached the turnout, the sun had already burned off the morning mist. The meadow lay wide open under that Oregon sky, so still it felt staged. The silver sedan sat under a thin veil of dust, neatly angled toward the road, both front windows cracked an inch. The keys were in the console, not the ignition. Small, careful choices that told me whoever parked it hadn't meant to disappear. I opened the driver's door, and the smell hit me. First, sun-warmed upholstery, faint citrus from spilled sunscreen. On the passenger seat was a Rite Aid receipt, time-stamped. Saturday, 12:17 p.m. Grapes, sunscreen, 2 colas. Nothing unusual, yet that scrap of paper felt heavier than it should have. Deputy McKendry arrived a few minutes later. We walked the short distance to the grass line, talking low. 20 feet from the bumper, the ground flattened into a soft green hollow. That's where we saw it, the picnic blanket laid out in perfect symmetry, corners still weighted with pebbles, a wicker basket beside it. Plates, crumbs, half-eaten grapes. Even the paperback Rachel had been reading was still there, face down, as if she'd just stepped away. There was no sign of struggle, no broken twigs, no footprints that said panic. Just the remains of a quiet afternoon waiting for its owners to return. Bill crouched, running a gloved hand through the grass. "No drag marks," he murmured. I remember nodding, though what struck me more was the silence. Usually a meadow carries sound, flies, distant birds, but that day it felt muffled, like the air itself was holding its breath. We took photographs, marked tire positions, logged the basket. Every step of procedure, but underneath it all, I felt the same unease I'd heard in Eleanor's voice. We called it in as a possible missing persons case, and by evening yellow tape stretched in a slow, uneven grid across the meadow. As the light faded, the scene looked almost holy lanterns, swinging radios, crackling officers, whispering like they were afraid to wake something. I remember Eleanor arriving around dusk. She stood behind the tape, clutching a jacket too big for her eyes, searching the tree line like she could will Rachel to appear. She asked if they'd maybe gone hiking. I told her we didn't know yet, that sometimes people wander off. She didn't argue. She just said Rachel doesn't wander. We brought in dogs that night. They sniffed one of Rachel's sweaters from home, circled the car, then pulled east along a narrow game trail. I followed the handler through underbrush slick with dew until the line stopped just short of a small rise on the far edge of the meadow. The dogs turned in slow circles, whining softly, then sat down. Beyond that point, the scent vanished. The handler looked at me and said, "It's like they walked off the map." I didn't know what to say, so I just marked it on the topo sheet, thin gray pencil, an X that didn't feel big enough for what it meant. We searched through the night and into the next morning. Helicopters swept the area with heat sensors, catching only deer and rock. By the second day, the place was crawling with volunteers. Teachers, store clerks, teenagers, people who knew Rachel from the hospital or Luke from the grill. The kind of small-town turnout that happens when bad news hits too close to home. I watched them comb the creek beds and call their names into the trees, voices echoing like church bells. But each time the sound died, the meadow fell silent again, as if it swallowed every trace. Inside the command tent, I studied the photographs from their camera prints laid out under a portable lamp. The first few showed their apartment, Luke making faces, Rachel laughing. Then the meadow came into view, bright with color, ordinary, timeless. In one, her sandals were kicked off in the grass. Another showed Luke's baseball cap balanced on the basket. The last image was different, crooked half-shadow. The edge of the blanket, the dark line of trees beyond it, and something faint behind the trunks. The text couldn't agree what it was. A shape, maybe human, maybe nothing. I didn't know either, but I couldn't stop staring at it. As days passed, the search widened, creeks, logging roads, cabins, even drainage ditches along the highway. Reporters started showing up, asking questions we didn't have answers for. The town turned anxious. Parents told their kids to stay in groups. Folks locked doors they hadn't locked in years. The Timberline Grill put up a photo of Luke by the register, "Missing, have you seen this man?" handwritten beneath. Sacred Heart Hospital did the same for Rachel. Each day those posters grew more weathered corners curling in the sun. I kept visiting the meadow. Couldn't help it. It changed with each passing week, grass, taller colors, duller, but that blanket image stayed burned into my mind. One afternoon, I walked the perimeter alone, tracing where the dogs had stopped. That rise to the east caught my attention again, just a small mound cluttered with thistles. From there, you could see the turnout clearly, even the car, if you knew where to look. Something about that view unsettled me. It felt like the perfect place to watch without being seen. But when I mentioned it at the next briefing, no one had the time or manpower to take the old hunter's blinds apart. We already searched that area, someone said, and the meeting moved on. The investigation turned mechanical, every theory tested, every dead end logged. We checked lakes for vehicles, pulled phone records, traced credit cards. Nothing. Their accounts froze the day they vanished. The ranger who'd seen them said he waved, they waved back. Nothing strange. The whole timeline came down to 40 minutes between that wave and the moment both phones went dark. 40 minutes that erased 2 lives. That fall, Eleanor started stopping by the station with baked goods, always the same reason. In case the team's still working, she'd say setting down a tray of muffins. I'd thank her, but she never lingered. It was her way of keeping faith that something was happening, that we hadn't given up. Truth was, most of us hadn't, but cases like that, they hollow out a department. You spend so long circling the same field that you start hearing your own footsteps instead of leads. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the meadow, covering everything like it was trying to forget. When spring returned, we went back with fresh eyes, combed the rise again. Nothing. Not a trace of the cooler or the grill or the 2 souls who'd come there laughing one July afternoon. Eventually, the search scaled back. Files went to storage. People tried to move on, though. Moving on was just a polite way of saying we didn't know what else to do. Still, certain details wouldn't leave me. That polished car, the calm footprints ending mid-trail, the receipt that placed them so clearly in time. It was like reading the first half of a sentence and realizing the rest had been erased. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one night flipping through the case notes. Outside, the wind rattled the siding. My wife had gone to bed hours earlier. I kept thinking about how ordinary that day had started for them, for me, for everyone, and how no amount of training prepares you for the sound of a mother asking if you're sure her child isn't coming home. A year passed. The case turned cold, then colder. Deputies transferred files, gathered dust. But every now and then, driving that stretch of highway, I'd glance toward the meadow. The grass always seemed to ripple the same way, even in different seasons. I'd catch myself slowing down, eyes searching the rise without meaning to. There's a kind of memory that sticks to land places where laughter once lived, then stopped too soon. When 2017 rolled around 19 years later, I'd been retired for almost a decade. My badge hung in a frame on the hallway wall. I spent most mornings fixing things around the property or driving into town for coffee. It was an ordinary July day when the phone rang. It was Bill, older now, voice rough from years of cigarettes. He didn't bother with small talk. "You might want to sit down," he said. "They found something out at Willow Bend." He told me a ranch hand clearing weeds had stumbled over a pile of rotted boards, the remains of that old blind we'd once ignored. Beneath it was a sun-faded cooler blue with a white lid, the kind you could buy at any hardware store back in the 90s. When he said that, my chest went tight. Then he added quietly, "There are letters carved in the lid." I drove out that afternoon even though no one asked me to. The road hadn't changed much, same turns, same wildflowers along the shoulders. But as I pulled over near the fence line, the air felt different, heavier somehow. Deputies had already marked the area with taped small flags fluttering in the wind. I saw the cooler sitting there, dirt still clinging to its sides, and for a moment the years folded away. It was like standing inside the echo of that first search. Only now time had finally revealed a whisper of what it kept hidden. I stepped closer, careful not to cross the markers. The sun hit the lid at an angle, catching the carved grooves. R+L. Simple, familiar, devastating. It was proof of something we'd always known, that they'd been here, that their love had been real, that someone or something had buried that moment on purpose. I stood there longer than I should have, the sound of wind moving through the grass like a low hum. Behind me, the meadow stretched out bright and indifferent as if it had never swallowed a secret at all. I didn't say much to the deputies before I left. There wasn't anything to say. Driving home, I kept thinking about that last photo, the tilted one, and the way the tree line leaned dark against the sun. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe it was the part of me that still works like a cop, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had watched them that day had been watching from that rise. That thought followed me all the way down the highway and into the years still to come, where the question waiting at the end of every road would always be the same. What happened in those 40 minutes when the world went quiet and never gave them back? When the news broke about the cooler, it was like the whole county took a collective breath. It hadn't realized it was holding for 19 years. That single object, sun-bleached, half-buried, carved with those initials, brought every memory back to the surface, and with it, the ache of not knowing. I went back out there 2 days later. The field was cordoned off again, yellow tape whispering in the wind, just like the summer they disappeared. New faces, now young detectives, forensic techs in latex gloves, carrying equipment we couldn't have imagined back then. They treated that cooler like it was a relic, photographing every angle, sealing it into evidence bags, swabbing for DNA that time had long erased. I stood off to the side, watching, feeling that same weight in the air, as if the land itself was remembering something. That night, I dug the old case files out of my garage. I still had copies, faded and worn. The notes, the maps, the photos of the picnic scene, they'd yellowed around the edges, but the handwriting was mine, and it brought me right back to those first nights when we believed the answers were just a day away. Looking through those pages now, the patterns felt different. The blind back then, it was standing tall, camouflaged with tarps, nailed together with a kind of permanence that didn't make sense for a casual hunter. I remember we logged it, but never looked inside. It was too high up, too solid, and we were stretched thin. But that's where the cooler turned up all these years later, right under the spot where someone could have sat and watched that entire meadow without ever being seen. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff's office formed a task force. They reopened interviews, tracked down witnesses we'd once written off. The ranger who'd waved to Rachel and Luke that afternoon was still alive, retired now, gray hair and a limp from an old injury. He told them the same story, 2 young people on a blanket laughing, the girl waving back. But this time, he added something new. As he rounded the bend, he said he caught a glimpse of movement higher up on that rise, a flicker of dark clothes. He'd assumed it was a deer, maybe a hunter. Didn't seem important then, he told me later. Voice thin. Wish I'd looked twice. The investigators compared his statement with an old call log from the day they vanished. There in the margins was a brief note a woman driving westbound had seen a man step out of the trees near the turnout around 4 o'clock. Tall, carrying something under his arm, headed toward the road. The report was never pursued beyond that line. In '98, we were buried under theories, and not every lead got the attention it deserved. But now, paired with the ranger's memory, it felt like a thread pulling tight after all these years. I sat in on one of their briefings that summer. The conference room was full, state police, a couple of FBI agents, young detectives, taking notes. The cooler sat on the table under glass initials facing up, like a question no one could answer. On the screen behind them, the timeline appeared in neat digital fonts. 12:17 p.m. Right aid receipt. 1:15 car seen turning into the turnout. 2:30 ranger waves. 2:47 last photo on the camera. 3:11 phones go dark. 4 to 12 witness sighting of unknown man. I'd looked at those times so many times over the years that they almost felt carved into me. But seeing them there again, framed by technology and hindsight, made it worse somehow. We'd lost them in that gap 40 minutes where daylight still ruled, where laughter still hung in the air. After the meeting, I walked outside to clear my head. Oak Ridge had changed new shops, fresh paint on the old diner, but the air still smelled the same pine and dust. I stopped at a vending machine, dropped in a quarter, and caught my reflection in the glass. I looked older, heavier in the eyes. Behind me, a deputy stepped out for a smoke and said quietly, "It's like they never left." I didn't answer. The next few weeks, news crews started circling. Vanished Picnic one headline read, "They interviewed Eleanor again. She'd never left Oak Ridge, never moved the photos from her living room wall. She told them she still kept Rachel's old phone in a drawer, couldn't bring herself to throw it out." When she spoke about the cooler, her voice trembled, but not with shock, with exhaustion. She said it wasn't the object that hurt. It was knowing someone had hidden it. The lab work came back empty. No blood, no fingerprints, no residue except for soil and faint traces of pollen. But that pollen caught someone's attention. It matched a plant species found only near that rise, the same patch where the dogs had stopped in 1998, the same patch visible in the background of that last photo. It meant the camera might have been closer to the blind than we'd thought. Maybe Rachel dropped it in panic. Maybe she lifted it in reflex, pressing the button as someone approached. No way to know, but it tightened the focus. The meadow wasn't just a backdrop. It was the scene. One evening, I met with Bill McKendry at a diner outside Eugene. He'd retired a few years before me, but the case never left him either. We sat in the corner booth, drinking coffee gone cold. He slid an envelope across the table, copies of old incident reports, including one I hadn't seen before. A name stood out, Randall Briggs. Back in '98, he'd been questioned after a bar fight near the logging road. Drifter type, mid-30s, known for squatting in hunting cabins. No solid ties, a couple of assault charges. He'd denied being near Willow Bend, and without physical evidence, he'd been released. Bill had checked. Briggs was dead now, a decade gone, heart failure somewhere near Idaho. But his file was messy, and one photo in particular caught my attention. A snapshot from a deputy's dash cam showing his truck parked not far from the forest line. Behind it, if you squinted, you could see the faint outline of a blind, same type of structure, same rough build. We sat there in silence for a long while. The diner TV played a muted baseball game, and somewhere behind us, a waitress laughed at something her coworker said. The world kept moving, but in my head, everything slowed down to that meadow again, that rise above the grass. Maybe Briggs had nothing to do with it. Or maybe he'd seen something he shouldn't have, the same way Rachel and Luke might have. Whatever the truth, the timing fit too neatly to ignore. The next morning, the task force searched the archives for records of registered blinds on public land from the late '90s. Nothing matched that location. The structure at Willow Bend wasn't legal. It hadn't been logged, tagged, or approved by the forestry office. Someone built it privately, quietly, with time and intent. They found fragments of camouflage netting and metal staples embedded in the rotten boards. Whoever made it didn't slap it together for one afternoon of hunting. They'd prepared it like a hide. That discovery changed everything. Theories that had sat dormant for years came roaring back. Maybe the couple had stumbled into something illegal, poaching drug activity, something worth hiding. Or maybe it was simpler and darker, a stranger waiting, watching from that blind, taking an opportunity no one else saw. It's the uncertainty that eats at you. We all wanted a story that fit, but the meadow refused to give one. Eleanor told me once she dreams about that place. She said in her dreams the grass moves like water, and sometimes she can hear laughter carried on the wind. "I wake up before it stops," she whispered. I told her I believed her, and I did. Some memories never stop echoing. By late summer, the press had quieted again, the story fading from headlines like everything does. But inside the department, the investigation stayed alive. A new generation of analysts went over those photographs pixel by pixel, enhancing the shadows in that last frame. One claimed they could make out the outline of a shoulder, maybe a head half-turned. Others said it was nothing but leaves and light. I asked to see it for myself. They printed it in high contrast, the colors flattened into gray. Holding it at arm's length, I saw what they meant. It could be either. But when I looked long enough, the image seemed to shift, like whoever was behind that lens wasn't just taking a picture, they were being watched. That night, I drove out to Willow Bend again. Old habit, maybe penance. The grass was taller, the trees denser, but the shape of the land hadn't changed. The air was cooler, and as I stood near the fence line, a storm flickered far off over the Cascades. Lightning revealed the meadow in brief, ghostly flashes. It struck me how ordinary it all looked, the kind of place you'd never think twice about. That's the part that still unsettles me most. How something so quiet could hold so much darkness. Before I left, I walked up to that rise. The remains of the blind were gone, cleared for evidence, but you could still see the square imprint where its posts had once sunk into the ground. Standing there, I could see the highway through the trees, headlights passing in thin streaks. You wouldn't notice it from the road, but from that vantage point you could see everything. The blanket, the car, the couple. You could have sat there for hours without anyone knowing you were there. I thought about that while driving home in the rain, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. The case file had grown thick again, filled with possibilities, but none of them had faces. The only constant was that cooler and the silence it broke. Every piece of evidence we found seemed to lead right back to the same question. Who was in that meadow with them? I pulled into my driveway past midnight, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark for a while. The rain had stopped, and all I could hear was the ticking of the cooling motor and the echo of those initials in my mind, R+L. The letters felt less like a sign of love now, and more like a marker something left behind to remind us that for all our searching we still didn't know who or what had walked out of those trees. And that question, after 19 years, was still waiting in the quiet of that field patient as ever. There's a certain kind of silence you learn to recognize in old cases, the kind that hums just before the ground gives something back. That's what it felt like in late 2017 when the FBI lab called with the preliminary analysis on the cooler. Nothing dramatic, just a steady voice reading through details, composition of plastic, depth of cuts, microscopic traces of soil, pollen embedded in the grooves. It wasn't what they found that struck me. It was what survived. 2 decades of Oregon weather hadn't erased the marks. Those letters were deliberate, carved with the same width as a pocket knife blade. When they said that, I thought of Luke, the way he was always flicking that knife open on his lunch breaks at the grill, whittling bits of wood into shapes for no reason at all. You could almost see him that morning carving their initials in the lid while Rachel unpacked sandwiches, not knowing he was cutting the last line of their story. After that report came in, the sheriff's office gave the case new life. You could feel the urgency again, the quiet electricity in the hallways, like maybe we were finally close. The task force brought me in as a consultant, not officially, just the old man who remembered where the bones of the investigation were buried. They'd set up their workspace in the old county annex, the one that used to be a library, and laid everything out on folding tables, photos, maps, satellite images, witness statements pinned like a spider web. The cooler sat under a protective cover at the center of it all, as if the rest of the evidence revolved around it. The initials caught the light each time someone passed. It made the room feel haunted. One afternoon, a young detective named Reed called me over. He had Rachel's digital camera images pulled up on his monitor, enlarged and sharpened by software we didn't have in '98. "Watch this," he said. He zoomed into that last photo, the tilted one where the blanket corner lifts in the breeze. He adjusted the contrast, and I saw it again, the shadow at the edge of the trees. It looked like nothing at first, then too much. A shape, maybe a person half turned, maybe just a trick of light. He froze the image and looked at me. "What do you see?" I told him the truth. "I see something that doesn't belong." That photo became the center of everything. They printed it large, circled it in red marker, and pinned it above the timeline. Everyone stared at it like it might blink back. But the more you look at an image like that, the less certain you become. It's not proof, it's suggestion. Still, it had weight. When I went home that night, I poured myself a drink and left the lamp on low, thinking about what it means to be watched without knowing it. The idea settled heavy in my chest. I'd driven past that meadow so many times, and it never once occurred to me that someone could have been hiding up there looking down through brush and wire. In the weeks that followed, we dug into every name that had floated through the original file. One came back to the surface, Randall Briggs. The drifter with the temper, the one who'd been picked up for trespassing a few days after the disappearance. His record was spotty, a trail of small crimes across 3 states, petty theft, public intoxication, and assault charge from a bar fight. He died in 2009 of a heart attack, cremated with no next of kin. But a retired ranger remembered seeing him around that same stretch of highway back in the late 90s, hauling scrap wood in an old pickup. Maybe he built the blind. Maybe he just used it. We couldn't prove it either way, but when we compared photos of his old campsites, there were similarities, same kind of netting, same style of construction. It wasn't enough for certainty, but it made the air in the room feel heavier. What still bothered everyone was how clean the scene had been. The blanket laid out neatly, no overturned plates, no spilled soda, no struggle. It looked like they stood up calmly and walked toward the trees. Even the footprints, one set lighter, one heavier, stopped after a dozen steps. That detail had always haunted me. You don't just vanish mid-stride. Soil holds memory. It should have said something panic, hesitation, direction, but instead it ended like punctuation. We ran models of wind erosion, animal interference, even soil compression patterns. Nothing explained it. The only theory that made sense was the simplest: they walked toward something or someone they didn't fear. Eleanor came to see me around that time. She'd aged in ways that had nothing to do with years. Her voice was soft but steady. She said she wanted to visit the site again, to stand where her daughter last stood. I didn't want her to go, but I knew better than to argue. We drove out together one gray morning, the kind where the air feels thick with rain but never delivers it. The grass had grown higher, the fence sagged. She stood by the old turnout, staring into that sea of green. "It looks smaller than I remember," she whispered. "I told her places always do when you return to them." She walked a few steps into the field, stopped and said quietly, "You can almost hear them laughing if you stand still." I wanted to tell her I'd heard it too in my head, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Back in town, the press conference for the 20th anniversary drew a small crowd. They displayed the cooler under glass, the letters visible under the bright lights. The sheriff spoke about renewed efforts, about new technologies and community cooperation. Behind him, photographs of Rachel and Luke flashed on a projector screen, smiling faces frozen in a summer that never ended. When it was over, reporters asked the same questions they always did. Did we believe they were still alive? Did we think the cooler had been hidden on purpose? I stayed silent. There's no good way to explain how evidence can be both everything and nothing at once. A week later, Reed called again. He'd been testing soil samples from beneath the collapsed blind. Nothing remarkable until one came back with microscopic fragments of synthetic fabric embedded in the clay. Blue and white. Same color composition as the cooler. That meant it had been there since the beginning, not moved later, as some had guessed. Someone hid it there intentionally, likely right after the disappearance. It didn't tell us who, but it narrowed the when. That mattered. I could feel the old pulse of the job again, the way your heart stirs when a clue finally aligns with logic. But it was a hollow victory. For every answer, 2 more questions appeared. I started walking the old paths near the meadow at dusk, something I hadn't done in years. The light in those hours has a strange quality, thin and gold, turning everything honest. You can see where the land dips, where the game trails still cut through the brush. Standing there, it wasn't hard to imagine the scene 19 years earlier. Rachel and Luke laughing, the hum of insects, the steady whir of summer heat. Then maybe a rustle near the rise. A voice. Maybe familiar, maybe not. the sound of someone stepping out of shadow. I tried to picture what they saw in that moment, and all I could think of was trust, the split second before fear has a name. The younger detectives pressed forward with digital mapping layering every witness statement, every photograph, every point of contact into a 3D model. They showed it to me one afternoon, the meadow recreated in pixels. You could rotate the scene, see where the blanket sat, where the blind towered, where the footprints ended. It was eerie watching it on a screen like a ghost town frozen mid-afternoon. They asked if anything looked different to me. I pointed to the line of trees east of the blind. "There's a clearing behind there," I said. "We never searched it properly. It's hard to see from the ground." The next morning, a small team went out. They found nothing new. No bones, no clothes, but they did find evidence of old fires, burnt tin cans, and a circle of flattened earth. Someone had been camping there years before. When I got the call, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the clock on the wall. You spend your life chasing closure, and the truth is, it rarely comes in one piece. It comes in fragments, soil ash, initials carved by hand. I told the detective to bag everything, even the ashes. He said, "You really think they'll tell us anything I said?" "They might someday." That night I dreamed of the meadow again. Only this time, it wasn't quiet. The wind was loud, and the grass bent in one direction like something heavy had moved through it. I could see the blanket, the picnic basket, and just beyond the trees, the faint outline of that blind, still standing tall. When I woke, the room was dark, the rain steady on the roof. I sat there listening, thinking about how we'd built our entire understanding of that day around what was visible. But maybe the truth was always in what we couldn't see: the eyes in the shade, the hands that took what they wanted, the silence that followed. A few days later, I drove back out one last time before the first snow. The meadow was pale, stripped of color, the air sharp with frost. I stood where the blind had been, looked down toward where the car once parked. The geometry of it was cruel, as if the land itself had drawn a trap we couldn't undo. I crouched down and touched the dirt where the posts had sunk deep. It was cold, hard-packed, but still faintly damp, the kind of soil that holds a secret long after it's told. As I straightened up, the wind cut through the trees, carrying a sound that could have been anything: branches shifting or something else moving deeper in. I didn't linger. Driving back toward town, I passed a news van parked at the overlook, reporters waiting for a story they could package neatly. I knew they wouldn't find one. The truth about that meadow wasn't a headline, it was an echo, one that kept folding in on itself year after year. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the valley turned blue. I thought about the ranger's wave, the receipt timestamp, the 40 minutes that still refused to speak. Maybe the answers were still out there buried under a few inches of soil, or maybe the meadow had decided to keep them. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever walked out of those trees that afternoon didn't just take 2 lives. It took the piece of a place that would never feel ordinary again. And as much as I wanted to believe the earth eventually tells the truth, that field on Highway 58 had learned how to stay quiet. When the task force finally shut down its operations that winter, the evidence table looked almost the same as the day it began. Files, photographs, that same blue cooler sitting under glass like it was still waiting to speak. We'd spent months testing, retesting, hoping that somewhere inside all that dust and plastic there was a name, a match, anything to close the gap between what we knew and what we could never prove. But there wasn't. The lab reports came back conclusive only in what they lacked. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers that tied to anyone living or dead, just time and the shape of 2 letters carved by someone who once believed love could outlast the world. There's no ceremony when a case fades again. The detectives packed their boxes, erased the whiteboards, and left the room quiet. I stood there alone a while longer, watching the reflection of those carved letters in the glass. I thought about Rachel and Luke, about how they'd stepped into that meadow believing it was just another summer afternoon, and how every search since had been a kind of echo. People walking the same ground, calling the same names, hoping the earth would answer. It never did. Eleanor came to see me one last time that spring. She brought coffee in a paper cup and a stack of photographs Rachel at the hospital Christmas party, Luke grilling in their tiny apartment kitchen, both of them at the county fair with powdered sugar on their faces. She spread them out on my desk like she was building proof of their existence, as if the world might forget them if she didn't remind it. "Do you still go out there?" she asked. I told her sometimes, but not as often as I used to. She nodded. "I don't either," she said. "I used to think that's where I'd find her. Now I think maybe she left that place behind before we ever did." Dean Hargrove made the trip from Idaho that same summer. He stood by the display at the sheriff's office, the cooler, the photos, the short timeline, and said it looked smaller than he'd imagined. He didn't stay long. He told me he was selling his shop, moving south to be closer to his sister. "I can't drive that highway anymore," he said. "Feels like the trees are still watching." He shook my hand before leaving his grip, strong eyes red. I didn't have words for him. Some things can't be softened by language. The reporters moved on to other stories, and the meadow returned to itself. Grass grew tall again. The fence line leaned further. Locals stopped pulling over there, and those who did rarely stayed long. Hunters avoided it altogether. They said it felt wrong, like the air was heavier there, or like you could still hear something under the wind if you stood too still. I never argued with them. I'd felt it myself. By 2019, the investigation was officially suspended. The sheriff called me into his office and asked if I'd help write the closing memo. It was mostly procedural language, dates, findings, recommendations, but at the end, he left a blank space, said I could write whatever felt right. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the document open in front of me, listening to the rain on the roof. After a while, I wrote, "We have the meadow, the blanket, the car, the cooler, the initials. We don't have them." I didn't know what else there was to say. That line stayed in the file, printed on the final page. It wasn't poetic. It was just true. Some mysteries end not with revelation, but with endurance. People stop searching not because they've stopped caring, but because the land has given all it's willing to give. I still visit from time to time. The road hasn't changed, same long curve, same whisper of pine through the open window. The turnout looks smaller now, half swallowed by weeds. I park a few yards back, stand at the fence, and watch the field breathe. It's beautiful in a way that hurts, sunlight sliding across the grass, dragonflies skimming low, the faint hum of the highway in the distance. It's hard to reconcile that peace with what happened there. Sometimes I think maybe that's what draws me back. The contradiction, the idea that horror can live quietly inside beauty for so long. The cooler sits in an evidence vault now labeled and cataloged, its edges cleaned but not polished. I like that they left the dirt in the grooves. Those small traces feel honest, like the land refusing to let go entirely. The initials still catch light when you tilt the lid, R+L, carved shallow but certain. I imagine them laughing while he cut those letters, the sound of the knife scraping plastic drowned out by her voice. It's a simple mark, but it carries more permanence than any headline we ever wrote. Every so often, I'll run into someone who remembers that summer. They'll mention how the whole town turned out with flashlights and dogs, how the church bells rang at noon for a week straight, how everyone believed the search would end in a rescue. I nod, let them talk. They're remembering hope, not loss, and that's all right. People need to hold on to something. For me, the hope shifted over the years. It's not about finding bodies anymore. It's about keeping the truth alive, however small it might be. That's why I still talk about it when folks ask, even when the words taste like dust. Because forgetting feels like letting the meadow win. The new deputies know the story. Most weren't even born when it happened, but they treat it with the respect it deserves. Sometimes during training, they'll bring recruits out to the site not for evidence, but for perspective. They say it's a reminder that every missing person's case begins with ordinary things: a car, a blanket, a sunny afternoon. It's a good lesson. We like to think tragedy comes with warning signs, but it doesn't. It moves quietly like a shadow at the edge of a photograph. Eleanor still lives in the same house on the north side of town. Every Thanksgiving, she sets an extra place at the table. Not because I expect her, she told me once, but because she was supposed to. There's something sacred in that kind of steadiness. Dean sends her Christmas cards now. They don't talk much, but they don't need to. Grief reshapes people in quiet ways. It doesn't end, it settles. As for me, retirement fits strangely. Some nights I wake before dawn and listen to the sound of freight trains echoing through the valley the same way they did the summer Rachel and Luke disappeared. That sound carries through everything: storms, seasons, years. It's a reminder that time keeps moving even when memory stands still. I've learned that's what real closure looks like, not answers, but acceptance. A few months ago, a local television crew filmed a piece about cold cases in Oregon. They asked if I'd be willing to speak on camera. I told them I would, as long as they filmed at the meadow and not in some studio under bright lights. We went out there in early evening, the sky painted pink and gold. They set up the tripod near the fence line. The reporter asked the usual questions, but one caught me off guard. "Do you believe the land remembers?" she said. I thought for a long moment before answering. "I think it does," I told her. "But not the way we do. It doesn't mourn, it just holds. The rest is up to us." They packed up their gear and left before dark, but I stayed a little longer. The wind had picked up, rustling through the tall grass. For a second, I could almost hear laughter carried on it, soft, quick gone before I could be sure it was there. Maybe memory plays tricks, or maybe the meadow was giving something back just for a heartbeat. I don't try to explain it anymore. Some echoes don't need to be understood to be real. When I finally turned to leave, I looked back once more at that stretch of field. The light had faded and everything was the color of old photographs. It struck me how small the place really was and how big it had become in the minds of everyone who loved them. 2 young lives one afternoon, and a silence that's lasted for decades. That's what endures, not the theories or the evidence, but the space they left behind. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Somewhere out there, another field, another silence is waiting to be broken. And remembering that's how we start.